video when you are talking to.
And we're live.
All right, welcome to the show. Tonight we're back for another round of Unapologetic Recommendations, the much promised sequel to our last episode on music. And I'm Caleb Johnston. Tonight I have with me, down here on the bottom,
I'm Clinton Wilcox.
And I am John Dunbar, back again. They couldn't get anyone else, so they're like, we'll get the non-apologist on.
Hey, you did a good job last time.
Yeah, sometimes it's not enough just having you on during the intro.
And we are live. That's it, guys. I'm out. I did my part. Thank you. I'll get my royalties check.
Yep, I'm sure the check's in the mail.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'll get on to the director Joel Furchess about that.
Yeah, my girl will call your girl.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's all on Joel. So take it up with him. If you could though, when you talk to him, ask where mine is too.
I will do that.
Okay, good deal. So last time we had a nice long discussion. It actually, went for a full episode when we were expecting it to just be a segment discussing music. And so essentially the whole goal with kind of these episodes is to take pop culture, mainstream media stuff and pull it in and take a look at it with our apologist hats on and see how we can relate and have conversations from this material and take this material in a way and pick it apart just enough that, when watching these with family or friends, or if it comes up in a discussion, how do you take this material and use it in order to have a maybe more relevant to eternity kind of conversation. So last time we touched on some pretty good music. What were some of our recommendations from last time, guys?
We did Collective Soul. We did almost an entire segment on Collective Soul. We should be getting that royalty check soon.
Mm-hmm.
and we just generally talked about how, a lot of their songs talk about spirituality, not necessarily the Christian faith, but it does allow you to talk to a person about, when he's talking about who's going to wear my crown. I want to find what I've lost and find meaning in this life. And we talk about how, to find ultimate true meaning and true purpose in life, you find that through Christ. And just using that as a gateway to, or an entrance to talk about your faith and open up conversations about, well, what do you think he was talking about when he's talking about, his wife going through all her, going through her pain.
Yeah. I thought it was a great discussion too. And, it made me go back and give a couple of their albums listen tos again afterwards, just to kind of pick through it again. And after our discussion, because it raised enough thoughts in my mind.
Yeah. I think we also talked about briefly King's Kaleidoscope. That was another one that we mentioned. They're a Christian quote unquote band now, so we're good.
Yeah, King's Kaleidoscope, and I talked about Kansas a little bit.
Kansas.
One of my favorite bands.
Yep. All we are destined to win.
Yeah, that's right. I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up Kansas in a music discussion.
And I had Joel threw out Cage the Elephant, and then I came in at the end with some Bad Religion. So so it was a great discussion, and hopefully listeners, if they haven't heard that one yet and they're fans of music at all, which I don't know anybody who doesn't like music, at least
Yeah.
to some degree.
Yeah.
So
totally.
it'd be a great episode for people to go back and give a listen to if you enjoy this sort of thing. Christians discussing, mainstream media and how it relates. There was actually a great article I read this week. I think you might have actually posted. It's where I saw it, Clinton. Is from Stand to Reason. Alan Schleman posted an article about mainstream media and movies and how Christians relate to it, and using it as a tool not just for pointing out the bad stuff or the bad worldviews in movies, but to use it to look for the good that comes out in things.
Yeah, I did post that. Yeah, maybe we should have reached out to Alan, see if he'd come on and discuss movies with us. But I think we'll be fine.
Oh, that would have been great.
Yeah. Speaking of that, I actually watched my poor YouTube history is horrible as far as like just miscellaneous like post rock and how-to videos and all that. But I watched a video on the hero types of the MCU, specifically Thor, Captain America, and Iron Man, and how that they each kind of represent different hero types or whatever. So it was actually pretty cool. The guy doing the video used Solomon Ecclesiastes for Captain America, I think. He did talk about Christianity with Captain America being a universal moral right, and how that there will always be good in the world. Like that's not obsolete, but an objective standard to good, and that's what Captain America upholds. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah,
that's awesome. Yeah, Captain America in the MCU has kind of always been the one that's kind of held it together for me. But for that, like when moral decisions come up, it's he's the one you look to for leadership on those things. And I think that's a really cool example, and I love using that as an example with my kids.
Cool.
Granted, they didn't bring in Tony Stark's alcoholism as much.
well, yeah,
He was a poor example of moderation.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is something that you hear some people talk about, especially those who are more philosophically inclined, is, you look at some of the movies, like especially with Iron Man. Iron Man starts out as a philanderer. He's, he has a ton of money. He's just all about, the extravagant lifestyle, and he's selling nuclear weapons and just other kinds of weapons to basically the highest bidder. And then he kind of goes through an arc, and after this character arc is done, by the end of the movie, he comes to realize that just some of the things he kind of learns through his journey. But the problem with this is that we still have these heroes who are very flawed individuals, and so that makes, even though I really enjoy superhero movies, but it kind of makes their heroism kind of unrealistic, because they're portrayed as people who have some kind of moral sense, and they're willing to risk their lives to help save the world, essentially, those kinds of things. But they don't have the character traits of real and actual heroes, because they still give into temptation to sleep around, for example, or with Scarlet Witch and Vision, for example, had a romantic relationship where they were sexually involved, that kind of thing. And so we think of heroes as people who are willing to basically to have a higher moral sense than us. And so if someone like a hero isn't willing to have moderation in their personal lives, like regarding sex and things like that, well, then it's not very realistic as far as how this can apply to reality, that they would be heroes in real life, because of the fact that they're not willing to have this sort of temperance in their personal life, means that in reality they wouldn't really even though they're portrayed this way on screen, in reality, it's not really realistic that they would be the kind of people who would, give their lives to help others or to save the world, that kind of thing. So even with Marvel movies, it still provides a lot of good, fodder for discussion about heroism and about the kinds of things heroes are and what kinds of personality traits heroes ought to have.
Yeah, you're right. I think there is a degree of, I certainly have to use some suspension of disbelief when watching those movies because of that reason. I think that if you gave an average person powers of some kind, unless they have a really strong moral character to begin with, it's going to be very tempting not to abuse it. Now, this is not necessarily a show or the comic book that I would recommend to most listeners, especially those under 18. But there's a comic that kind of explores this, The Boys. It's a comic that essentially explores, and Amazon put out a TV show on it last year as well. But it essentially explores, what if characters were actually a little more average and, people who get powers abuse them, and it's all about a group that tries to keep them in check given their moral shortcomings. And it's very, very graphic, but it definitely struggles with that moral issue in terms of, what if you really gave average people powers? Even some of the better people would come to abuse that and utilize it in ways that are really disturbing, actually.
Yeah,
it reminds me. There was a like in the 80s. There was the Super Friends, and they were doing the origin stories of one of the Native American guy that could grow tall through his magic powder. His counterpart in the Legion of Doom was this lady, and she was there when the shaman was telling the young brave about the power, and the woman grabs it, and he says, because the shaman had told the brave, don't be afraid, because whatever you use, whatever emotion you have or whatever feelings you have when you grow tall are just going to get magnified. And so the brave's like, okay, cool, I'm going to be brave, and blah blah blah. And then the lady snatches the thing with her whip, and the shaman gives her the same warning, and she's like, well, I don't care. And so she becomes a supervillain because of that, because her feelings of greed and power and that stuff were magnified. So it's similar to that of, hey, this person is just an average person and they get superpowers. So, and then this happens. There was The Invisible Man, I think, with Kevin Bacon. That was kind of he lost, because he couldn't see himself in the mirror. He kind of lost all moral boundaries and
Hollow Man.
Hollow Man, that was it. So it's similar.
But yeah. Have you seen the new Invisible Man that came out earlier this year?
I have not. No.
I haven't either, but it's one that I plan to see pretty soon.
Yeah, that's on my list too.
Cool. So what are we talking about tonight, Caleb?
Yeah, so we've kind of dove in and explored the superhero genre. We may have to do a whole breakdown of that one of these days if people like this kind of show.
Definitely.
But tonight, we're going to start off. We've got a few movies on the list, and we're going to start off with Jurassic Park.
All right.
So, any kind of initial thoughts on Jurassic Park? What kind of issues come up from this movie? Now, for listeners who may not be familiar with it, they should be, since this is probably the most blockbuster of the movies we're going to discuss.
Yeah.
But
we should import a spoiler tag just in case.
Oh,
yeah.
You should have already seen the movie because it's a great movie, so go see it. But just in case, we are going to be spoiling the films because
it came out in 1993, so I mean they've only had a couple of years to see it.
Right. Don't tell me you saw the Super Mario Brothers instead. I mean, come on. No, I'm joking. I actually like the Super Mario Brothers movie too, but it actually came out, I think, a couple months before Jurassic Park did. and thankfully didn't affect Jurassic Park at the box office.
For as horrible as that movie was, I still have a special place in my heart for it because
Yeah, me
it's
too.
so ridiculous.
It is, and the three actors, John Leguizamo, Dennis Hopper, and Bob Hoskins, were all really great in that movie, considering what they had to work with. The acting was really good, but
Right.
three good actors. So, but yeah, the movie definitely kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, Mars Attacks.
Uh, Yeah,
Man.
so
All right.
yeah, I mean Jurassic Park. I guess I can give a quick synopsis about it. Spoilers, there we are. All right. Yeah, so Jurassic Park is just a film about a couple of archaeologists who are invited to an island by an entrepreneur named John Hammond. And when they arrive, they discover that John Hammond has actually hired a group of geneticists to basically genetically engineer dinosaurs. The intention is to basically open a park, basically a zoo, where these dinosaurs would roam, and you could drive in trucks and go around and see these dinosaurs. And so, of course, in the course of the film, there's a lot of philosophical discussion about, is John Hammond basically playing God? Is he screwing with nature? All these kinds of things. Does he even have the moral right to have done this, to bring back these animals, which essentially nature caused to go extinct? As one of the characters says, they had their chance, and nature selected them out. So there's all these philosophical discussions, and so in the course of wanting to prove to his lawyer, to a mathematician, and to these archaeologists, he wants to prove that the park is safe, and wants them to give their blessing so that he can open it. But in the course of the film, we see that one of the workers there inadvertently caused the dinosaurs to get loose, because he was trying to sell some dinosaur embryos to a third party, essentially. And he ends up shutting off all the power, but before he can turn the power back on, he ends up getting killed. And so the dinosaurs, since the fences have essentially stopped being electrified, the dinosaurs now are able to get loose. And so now they have to deal with not just the herbivores, but the carnivores that they created, the raptors and the Tyrannosaurus Rex and things like that. And so, of course, now the dinosaurs are running amok, tries to kill them, and so they have to try and make it off the island. Essentially make it off the island safely. They get separated. One of the archaeologists has to watch John Hammond's granddaughter and grandson, and so essentially the whole movie from that point on is just basically them trying to survive the island. And there's a lot of really great stuff in it. It's a monster movie, but it's a monster movie with a brain. In that it raises a lot of interesting questions, and they even have that kind of discussion in it. None of the various sequels have been nearly as good as the first one. Like, I like The Lost World. I like the first sequel. The second one is okay, and then it kind of goes downhill from there. But the first movie is great. Definitely the best of the bunch, and it's definitely the one that does the best job of investigating these questions and raising them, and looking at it from both sides, but still kind of showing that nature is not really something that we should be messing with in this way, essentially. So yeah, I tend to side with Ian Malcolm, who of course is played by what's his name?
Jeff Goldblum.
Jeff Goldblum, who essentially plays Jeff Goldblum in every movie he's in. But he's a very charming actor, so I really like Jeff Goldblum. But he plays Ian Malcolm, and he has, I think, a lot of the best lines in the movie were given to Ian Malcolm. So yeah, so essentially the questions that are raised are, is John Hammond playing God? Does he have the right to bring these animals back from extinction, essentially? That's pretty much the main question, but there are a few others. John Hammond has to deal with the fact that he may have inadvertently gotten his own grandchildren killed when he gets separated from his grandchildren, and so essentially one of the character arcs between John Hammond and between one of the archaeologists Grant, Dr. Grant, Alan Grant. Alan Grant essentially starts off the movie as what we might consider kind of a Luddite. Like, he opposes technology. He thinks that you have to get in there with your hands. You don't want technology to take the place of human ingenuity. And John Hammond is all about technology because he wants to bring these dinosaurs back and have people come and see them so that he can make money. At this park. And through the course of the film, John Hammond comes to realize that technological advancement without an ethical sense leads to disaster. Because the dinosaurs got loose, and he didn't have, he really didn't think it through when he created these dinosaurs. And through the process of it, Dr. Grant himself actually comes to realize that technology is not all bad. Especially because it can, sometimes it can even mean the difference between life and death. So there's also kind of a character arc between John Hammond and Alan Grant too, in that they both grow in various ways regarding technology and the ethics behind it and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and that's a pretty good synopsis of it. And I agree that they gave Jeff Goldblum's character Ian Malcolm some of the good, like, moral questions of the movie, because again, like you're saying, the Dr. Grant and his partner are not
Ellie Sattler,
are not as into the moral and philosophical aspect of it. At first Grant's just amazed to see a brontosaurus walking around. And then, by the end of the movie, he's, had a change of heart after getting chased by velociraptors and Tyrannosaurus Rexes.
Yeah. Now, of course, Alan Grant, of course, was given the line, after thorough consideration, I have decided not to endorse your park, which is a great line. But it's a very, very quotable movie too. And the special effects, we're here to talk about the bioethic aspect, but the special effects are second to none. It was one of the earliest movies that actually incorporated CGI. And it was done before CGI started taking over practical effects. Now movies are just done primarily with CGI, very little practical effects, if any. But Jurassic Park was done primarily with practical effects. Like, they had real scale models of dinosaurs there on the sets, and then they did a little bit of CGI to enhance the scenes with the dinosaurs in them. So it was one of the earlier movies with CGI, but the effects still hold up. And if you haven't seen Jurassic Park, the first scene where Alan Grant first lays his eyes on the dinosaurs is a pretty glorious scene, and it's so great that they tried to mimic it in every Jurassic Park sequel.
Yeah.
It's like, we've seen this already. It worked in the first movie, but now we don't need the glory scene every time we watch a new film because we've seen it. But the first time it was really done really well.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, just a note on that, talking about the graphics and stuff. The film was selected for the preservation in the National Film Registry of the Library of Congress. Oh, okay. So it's a culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant movie. So definitely go out and see it. But other than that, so what do you think? What leads this to being bioethicist? I mean, like, what purpose? Like, is it bad that I want my pet poodle back?
So like I said, there are a lot of interesting questions raised by this, because we can talk about bringing someone back from the dead or preventing them from dying, but here we're talking about bringing a whole species back that has been selected by nature for extinction. So that kind of adds a whole new wrinkle to it. In fact, this was even brought up in the movie, that there are certain animal species that humans have caused to go extinct. So it might behoove us to try and bring them back if we can, but that's a whole different level from actually bringing back a species of animal like dinosaurs that nature itself selected for extinction. So there's that difference, which I think is a meaningful difference that Ian Malcolm makes in the film. So the bioethical concern here is, number one, regarding cloning. Because obviously the dinosaurs, in the course of the film, which I've heard scientists talk about this, that the science, sounds convincing, but it's not really realistic about how they can essentially find dinosaur DNA and fill in the gaps in the DNA with frog DNA to kind of fill in those gaps so that they can bring these dinosaurs back. So the science isn't exactly really realistic, although it does sound convincing. But yeah, so cloning is of course a bioethical issue, and cloning animals, like they have cloned actual animals. They cloned a sheep, and I think they've cloned another animal species too. That's not as problematic as cloning an actual human being, because number one, you have to destroy embryos in order to clone successfully. So it's a lot more morally problematic to kill a human embryo, especially for scientific experimentation, than it is to kill an embryo from another animal species. So there's that aspect, but also there's the aspect of things like genetic uniqueness. I myself am genetically unique, but if someone were to clone me against my will, well, then there would be two people with my DNA out there, when in fact I was just unique. Now, this argument isn't the strongest argument one can make, because of course there are such things as genetic twins, and twins are essentially a natural form of clones, because one embryo essentially buds off from another and creates a genetically identical twin, even though there are some things about them that are not identical, but genetically they're identical. So twins are kind of a natural form of twins. So the genetic uniqueness isn't the strongest argument, but I think it can show that at the very least it's wrong to clone someone against their will, because you're basically removing their genetic uniqueness. But yeah, so there are a lot of questions that are raised by cloning, and that's the primary question that's raised by Jurassic Park.
Right. Well, I remember, like, his famous line, maybe Malcolm, your scientists were so preoccupied with whether they could, they didn't stop to think if they should.
That's my favorite line from the movie. I've used that one a lot in my discussions.
Yeah, I think it's a good one, because it shows us that, again, with technology advancing as much as it is, just because we can do something, should we do something? And then that leads to, just a conversation about legal versus moral right. Is it legal to do this versus the moral right to do this?
Right. Yeah, I mean, that is definitely one of the questions to consider too. And this is why bioethics is so important, at least in theory, because you want people who are specifically trained in ethics to be telling scientists and doctors, this is okay, this is not okay, that kind of thing. If doctors and scientists just proceed without having any sort of ethics board they have to answer to, well, then they run the risk of doing things which are it could be slightly immoral, but they could also do irreparable damage to the human species if they mess with genes too much. And there is a danger with genetic editing too, which that's more in the realm of Gattaca, which I think we're going to get to in a little bit. Jurassic Park is more about cloning, so there are definitely ethical concerns regarding genetic enhancement as well. But regarding cloning, one of the major concerns is that you actually have to destroy embryos for it, and so destroying embryos, especially human embryos, is immoral. Not so immoral if we're talking about other animal species, but then you have other things like it's immoral. At least I would argue it's immoral to artificially conceive a human being in a lab. So I think in vitro fertilization, for example, is intrinsically immoral. That's not to say anyone conceived through IVF is less human or less of a person or less valuable. I don't think anyone conceived through IVF is less valuable. I do think they've been harmed, even if they're not aware of the harm. But so I do think that that conceiving a human being out, in a lab artificially is immoral for several reasons. And incidentally, that's actually kind of a controversial claim in the pro-life movement. A lot of pro-life people don't see eye to eye with me on that. But my view has actually been. I've actually taken my view from reading, books on the experts, not just from pro-life bioethicists, but also from theologians who talk about this as well. And so Edwin Huey is, for example, one that I've read who wrote a book and covered things like IVF and things like that, and talks about the intrinsic immorality of it. And so, so my view, it's not something I just made up. It's something that I've come to accept through doing research and reading the experts and that kind of thing.
Cool.
Yeah.
That's interesting. That's certainly something that my own opinion on differs a little bit there. I certainly disagree with the destruction of any embryos that would just be destroyed. Um, but again, I don't have the background you do, so that might be another great discussion for us to have
Yeah.
one night.
Right. Yeah, and that's the uncontroversial one. Like you'll be hard pressed to find a pro-life person who doesn't think IVF is immoral if you destroy embryos.
Right.
But a good number of pro-life people think that if you just conceive one embryo and you attempt to implant that one embryo, you're not doing anything wrong by conceiving it artificially. And that's where I would disagree with as well. So yeah, but and bioethics is a very, very complex topic, and so you can teach an entire class on bioethics. But,
right. So,
go ahead.
quick question. Currently, we're unable to do cloning without the destruction of an embryo. If at some point in time in the future we are able to grow, quote unquote, just bodies, like there's no sentience to this, it's just we either grow a body without a head or grow a body without a brain. Is the moral argument against cloning still there for that if I'm simply having a brain transplant? We have lung transplants and we have other organ transplants. If the body is harvested ethically, is cloning still an issue morally?
Who have you been reading? That's a question I have heard raised. That's kind of a difficult question, and
Okay.
I'm not sure I can give a very satisfying answer on that. There are, like you say, some considerations there. If you're going to conceive, like, is it permissible, for example, to grow a human liver in a lab? And if it's permissible to grow a human liver because you're just growing a part of a human, you're not growing a whole human, well, is it then permissible to grow a whole body, without the head? Or is it permissible to grow a whole body with the head but without a brain? When does it become when does it actually become wrong to grow that human in the lab? And I think definitely if you're growing an actual human organism, I think that's a clear case of when it's wrong.
Right.
It becomes a little more murky if you're talking about growing, parts of humans.
Right.
Yeah, because then again, there are some scientists who are actually working on growing a human brain, and then of course,
Oh, wow.
and this is actually ethically controversial among bioethicists because a bioethicist who opposes this, not necessarily a pro-life one, just one who opposes this on the grounds of that you're basically creating a self-aware individual. If you grow a human brain, and again, this is kind of a question too, because this is something I might disagree with them on. If you grow a human brain and that human brain becomes self-aware, you're essentially creating a disembodied human being who's essentially locked into his own brain. And so that is not an existence that is favorable, but it's also not an existence that any of us would want to live. In fact, it sounds like a kind of scary existence to exist as only a brain. So if you grow a brain in a lab, you might actually be creating a self-aware human individual who's basically locked inside his own brain.
Right.
So there are a number of bioethicists who would actually oppose that kind of thing. Now, so the question becomes then, well, what is it that makes a human a human? If you just have a disembodied brain, are you actually creating a human? I'm a little skeptical about that because I think that I'm a Thomist, and so I believe that humans are irreducible composites of form and matter.
Can you explain that for those who may not be in the know?
Well, sure. I mean, a Thomist would essentially, and I'm not an expert on Thomism either, but this is how I ground my pro-life views and my bioethical views more generally. A Thomist would affirm that basically they affirm what's called essentialism, and essentialism is the view that there are such things as natures being an immaterial essence that makes a thing what it is. So, for example, if we think of a triangle, well, what's the essence of a triangle? It's to have three sides, and so any three-sided polygon then is a triangle. How do we, is a four-sided polygon a triangle? Well, no. How do we know? Because it has four sides instead of
Right.
three. So what we would call a square, a four-sided polygon, lacks triangularity, because the essence of triangularity is to have three sides, but a square has four sides. So the way that we can distinguish one thing from another is if there are such things as natures. So a human being then has a nature too. The nature of a human being, the essence, is what we, the form of the thing is what we would call it. And when it comes to living things, we would say that their essence is essentially their soul. All living things have souls. Plants and trees have souls, animals have souls, and humans have souls, but they have different degrees of souls. So human beings have a rational soul, whereas animals have an animal soul, and plants and trees have a vegetative soul. The vegetative soul is kind of the lowest of the three soul types. And what makes a plant or a tree with a vegetative soul have a vegetative soul is that they have certain capacities, like they're able to take in nutrients and they're able to grow. And then you have the next higher, which is the animal soul, which is what, dogs, cats, lions, tigers, all lower
Bears.
animals have. And bears, right? Lions, tigers, and bears. Oh my. So they have the capacities that you find in the vegetative soul, the ability to take in nutrients and to grow, but they also have locomotion. They're able to move under their own power. And then you have the third level of soul, which is the rational soul. That's what humans have. And so the rational soul has the two lower levels. We have the capacities of the vegetative and the animal souls, but we also have a rational soul. And so we're able to, to do things which we often think of as rationality. We're able to recognize morality. We're able to live according to our ethics, essentially. We're able to engage in higher reasoning. We're able to speak through language, things like that. So that's really what I mean when I say that humans have a rational nature, is that it's basically our essence, what makes us what we are, and grounds our ultimate capacities. So when it comes to actually creating a human brain, I might take the position, well, maybe we shouldn't, just in case. But, if I kind of view a human being as, being an irreducible composite of form and matter. And so in order for a human being to be a human being, they have to have their physical part, but they also have to have their form as well. And so the question then becomes, if you just create a brain in a lab, does it then have a human form? Now, a form doesn't necessarily mean the shape of a human. So it's not, because, we would, Thomas would say that human embryos have a human form. And so they're one of us. So it's not necessarily what the thing looks like. It's just, the essence, that kind of the underlying essence of it, that grounds its ultimate capacities and makes it what it is. There's probably a more technical definition than that, but I think that pretty much works to illustrate it. So the question then becomes, if you create a brain in a lab, does that brain have the form of humanity? Well, there are certain things that it seems like it would lack, like it's not able, it's not able to move under its own power, for one thing, because it lacks having limbs. So, so really, how you would feel about that is what you think of as a human being. So I'm not 100% sold on my view there. So I would say you're probably not creating a human, but I'm not so sure that I would say, yeah, let's go ahead and create brains in labs. I think if there's even a remote possibility we could be creating a human locked into his own brain, I think that we should really avoid that. So you raised an interesting but very complex question that took some time to go over. And I see you mentioning the ship of Theseus. Here in the private chat, and that all kind of goes together with this, because when we talk about the essence of a thing, we would say that a human being is a substance, and a substance is something that maintains its identity through change. So, I was a human being when I was an embryo. Obviously, I've gone through changes when I was an embryo. I'm a lot bigger. I'm able to engage my rational faculties. I'm able to speak English. All of these things I'm able to do now are changes that I went through from when I was an embryo, because I had to develop all of the hardware in order to allow me to be able to exercise these capacities. I had these capacities as an embryo, but I had them in sort of a latent form. They were latent within me, and it just took time for me to be able to develop all of the necessary parts for me to be able to exhibit these properties. So I was still a member of a rational kind when I was an embryo, but I had to develop my brain in order for me to be able to exercise my rationality. Now, the ship of Theseus is a thought experiment that says, well, if we talk about something like an artifact, like a ship, well, if we remove certain parts from an artifact, when does that artifact cease to be what it is?
Right.
Now, a human, we would say, is a substance. So we would say that any change I undergo that doesn't kill me retains my identity, which is why I am identical to that embryo that was there as when I was conceived inside my mother's fallopian tube, essentially. So I'm a substance. I maintain my identity through change. But a ship is what we would call an artifact. An artifact is not like a substance. There are a few things different between artifacts and substances. A substance, we would say, exists and is the whole is ontologically prior to its parts. Now, what that essentially means is that not prior in the temporal sense, but in that the whole takes priority over the parts. So.
Gotcha.
So we would say that that embryo was a human being, a human being with a human soul, even before it developed its parts, because the whole embryo takes metaphysical priority over all of its parts. It develops all of its parts from within itself because it's on a self-directed path of development. And so it develops itself, and all of its parts come from within itself. An artifact is different in that its parts are ontologically prior to the whole. So an artifact doesn't actually exist until you create it. And so we can think of a car. Well, what's a car? Well, a car is something that transports me from point A to point B. It can transport people or it can transport cargo. And so you can kind of think, well, when does a car become a car if you're trying to construct it on in the Ford factory or whatever? Does it become a car when you put the wheels down? Does it become a car when you put the frame on? All of these kinds of things. I would say you don't actually have a car until it's able to function as a car, because artifacts, they find their identities in their parts. And so I have a van that's out in my backyard right now, and it's basically kaput. I'm not able to drive it. So essentially what I have is just a very big paperweight. It's a car in name only. It looks like a car, but it's not actually a car because it's not able to function as a car.
Right.
So the ship of Theseus thought experiment then is meant to show, well, at what point, if I remove parts from the ship of Theseus, at what point does it cease to be what it was? And so if we can think of the ship, which is made of wood, and of course wood rots and deteriorates over time. So once a plank of wood deteriorates and you replace the wood, is the ship the same ship that you just had before, or is it different because you've just replaced one of its parts? Well, it seems like if an artifact finds its identity in its parts, then if all of the parts are not identical to it, then it seems like it's not the same thing once you replace a plank. You still have a ship, but it seems like you don't really have the same ship that you had before. It's a different ship because you've replaced one of its parts. Even if you don't think one change is enough to make it something different than what it is, it seems like there's at least some point at which you can replace enough of it in order to make it something different than it was before. And so you can actually think of consider you're replacing planks one by one as they deteriorate, and finally you replace every single plank on the ship of Theseus, but you have saved every original part from the original ship, all the planks, all the nails, everything. And so then you recreate the original ship of Theseus, hammering all the planks, all the nails, and everything into a warehouse somewhere. The question then becomes, the ship that you've replaced or the ship that you've recreated in the warehouse, which is the original ship of Theseus?
Right. So I guess you could say that the using, because I've heard the ship of Theseus, it's like, are you still a human if you get your arm replaced? Well, yes. Or well, and you just take that to the extreme of, if I download my conscious into like a positronic brain, am I still a human? But the argument falls in that the ship of Theseus is an object or a thing, whereas humans are a person. And so because we are created with mind and body and soul or spirit, that makes us different from a thing. So therefore, using the ship of Theseus on in regards to maybe cloning or body modifications to humans doesn't really work, because you're actually talking about two different entities, or literally two different things. You're talking about a person versus an object, and therefore the two, while it's parallel, it's not necessarily correlative.
Yeah, so it's parallel in that both an artifact and a substance has parts,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not parallel in how the substance or the artifact finds its identity.
Okay, cool.
So yeah, so you can replace your arm, and it's not just that you continue to persist as human; it's that your identity continues to persist. So you're still the same individual you were before, because you retain your nature, you retain your essential properties, the things that make you what you are. So yeah, but the ship of Theseus, because a ship finds its identity in its parts, then if you replace a part, or at least if you replace enough of the parts, the ship ceases to be the same ship that it was before. It's still a
Right.
ship, but it's not the same ship because you've replaced its parts. And so
Right.
that's part of the whole ship of Theseus thought experiment, is meant to investigate at what point does an artifact cease to be what it was before. And so which is the original ship? Is it the one that you've replaced, or is it the one that you've constructed from all the original parts in a warehouse?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's just essentially what it's meant to excuse me, to investigate. And so a living thing like a human being is different. We're substances, and so we maintain our identity through change. So as long as the change I undergo doesn't kill me, I remain the same individual at all points throughout all of these changes.
Cool.
Yeah, and on a side note, I think the interesting thing about the human body, and I was trying to do some research to make sure this was true, because I've heard it said that the human body, every cell within the body eventually replaces itself after 7 to 10 years. So, we're already constantly replacing things and developing and growing. It's a process as a part of being human, versus, I mean, with a ship, you have to have pieces replaced as well, versus something that's already being done as a natural part of what you are.
Right.
So kind of a form, like we are a form. My substance doesn't change simply because my epidermis is, I shed my epidermis on a consistent basis. That doesn't change who I am as a person. Whereas, I got to replace the stern on the ship or whatever. It is completely different. So cool.
Yeah, and I have to apologize. My epidermis is showing tonight.
Ooh, not on this show. We're a family show. You gotta.
No, I'm sorry. I apologize about that.
Yeah. Remember we had to edit the One Collective Soul song.
Now, see, you're throwing DC Talk references in here at this point.
Actually,
We're getting back to music.
Yeah, that was a joke that I heard at school. I think that's where they heard it too. So I didn't feel it specifically from DC Talk, but we likely heard the same joke.
Yeah.
So yeah,
completely.
So to bring things back around a little bit, we kind of were talking about Jurassic Park and went down the whole cloning road and a lot of the philosophical questions that came with that. To make one final note before we kind of move on, because we're really already leading into the discussion with Gattaca a little bit. But, I think for me, one of the most interesting things with Jurassic Park, looking back as an adult, having seen it when I was much younger, is the God complex question. I mean, the same issue that we were talking about with superhero genre is, somebody who's given power, whether it's by some unnatural means or through science. It's well known that a lot of doctors have God complexes because they are usually the most advanced in their field, particularly neurosurgeons. Are even so high up among other doctors that, it's hard not to develop a God complex without a really healthy dose of humility. And when you reach the top of your field like that, and are the best at what you do, and when you're directly intervening and saving human life, so I think that issue comes up a lot, and I'm not being down on doctors by any means. There are many who take that dose of humility and are some of the most wonderful people I've ever met. But it's that power, whether it's through technology or knowledge or some supernatural means, like the superhero genre we were talking about. I think that's an interesting question as it comes up in Jurassic Park is, how does technology interact with us versus how do we utilize it? And, when are we using it as a means of power? And I think that's one of the sub themes kind of there that continuously comes up in the sequels as well, is this power over technology. And same thing comes up in the show Black Mirror a lot. We'll have to save that for a TV episode of this, because it has lots of episodes we could discuss.
Yeah, I've never actually seen Black Mirror. I've heard some good things about it, but
Yeah.
all the Jurassic Park sequels are basically just repeating the same themes, essentially. That's one of the reasons why they're just not as good, because not only have we seen it before, but Jurassic Park, the first one, just did it better than any of the others. Like I said, I still like The Lost World, but that even The Lost World has issues. But yeah, the first one is about as close to a perfect film as you can get, and then the sequels just kind of progressively go downhill.
Now, the most recent one added to the ethical dilemmas just a little bit, in terms of you get the hint at the end of the movie that they have spliced human and dinosaur DNA. And it may be interesting to see where they go with that in another one. I thought it was one of the most interesting ethical issues they've raised.
Yeah.
Since the first one.
Yeah, and I might as well mention that in the first one, Alan Grant has another character building moment too, because he starts out not liking kids at all, and he actually scares a kid who questions about raptors being so dangerous. And by the end of the movie, because he spent the whole movie basically protecting a couple of kids from being killed by dinosaurs, he actually learns to appreciate them. So that was another kind of character building aspect from Dr. Grant also, which I thought was probably important to mention. But
and I think that's interesting. You see kind of that parallel as well, because Hammond has kind of this poor parenting model. It's more of a, as a grandparent, he's so much absorbed in his work and kind of his artificial parenting with the dinosaurs, versus you see this kind of natural parenting, even for somebody who's not biologically related to these kids.
Yeah,
it's a really, really interesting parallel that I think we see in real life, when there are some parents who don't act like parents, and then you have, people like foster parents or adoptive parents that come in and really fill that role perfectly, even for people that aren't biologically related.
Yep.
All right, so we kind of touched on some of this conversation already, but let's dive into Gattaca.
Yeah. Gattaca is one I don't know nearly as well as Jurassic Park. I actually watched it again this week to refresh myself on it. It was my second time watching it, and the first time I didn't enjoy it as much as I did this second time, which could have been because I was watching it with other people. And this time I was just watching it by myself, and I was really zeroing in on it. But Gattaca is a really, really good film. Aside from just the ethical questions that it raises, the interesting questions, it's just a really well-made film too. From what I understand, I think it was a first-time director. When someone like Steven Spielberg has a successful movie, it's like that's he's known for great movies. But when a first-time director comes up and does a great movie, especially one as intellectual as Gattaca, that's definitely an achievement too.
Yeah,
that's true. So let's give people the 1 minute synopsis of Gattaca. Hopefully they've seen it, but we're throwing up the spoiler warning just in case.
Right. Again, if you haven't seen it, go see it. Great movie. Basically, Gattaca is a movie that investigates similar themes, but instead of talking about cloning, it's actually about genetic enhancement. And so Gattaca then is a film set in the future. I think it's like 2050 or something like that. But anyway, it's in the really near future, and genetic enhancement has become a reality, so that you can basically go to a doctor, a scientist in a lab, and get designer children. You can tell the doctor what traits you want your child to have, what gender you want your child to be, all of these things. You can make them a musician with 12 fingers, to facilitate better playing. They talk about how there's a piece of music that was written that is only playable by someone with 12 fingers. As a musician, that kind of bugged me a little bit, because I'm thinking, well, okay, if one person can't play it, you use two pianos, two players would play. But but I digress. So basically, you can basically create designer children, and now they haven't absolutely mandated that everyone has to create designer children. There are still couples that will conceive naturally, but society has progressed to a point now where naturally born children are basically the dregs of society, and the enhanced children are the ones that get all the prestigious jobs. The ones who are conceived naturally get the janitorial work, cleaning bathrooms and things like that, while the ones who are basically genetically enhanced and genetically engineered are able to be the scientists and the astronauts, because they don't have the possibility for like genetic deformities and things like that. And so in the course of the film, the lead character, played by Ethan Hawke, is conceived naturally, and then the parents decide to have their second child, but this time they want to have it genetically enhanced. And so the film follows these two children and the struggles that they have to undergo. The naturally conceived child has dreams of becoming an astronaut, but because he has some kind of genetic deformity that negatively impacts his heart. In fact, he's not expected to live beyond about 30 years. He's basically told he can't be an astronaut because it's too dangerous, and he's not one of the enhanced people who would be able to for sure survive going into outer space and going to the moon Titan, essentially, where he wants to go to set up a base there. And that was also something that didn't kind of really strike me as believable, because it's supposed to be a year-long trip, but it takes, at our current rate of speed, it takes about 6 months to get to Mars. So I'm not sure how you're going to be able to go to a moon of Saturn and back, and set up a base, and take your tests and everything in the course of a year. So that took a little bit of suspension of disbelief. You have to have like a headcanon that, okay, it should be longer than a year, but essentially, because they brought stuff in a rocket like we do today, so obviously they don't have like advanced propulsion technology, so that didn't really make sense either. But essentially, the film now follows these two characters.
Side note, it took the voyage, Pioneer 11 took 6.5 years to make it to Saturn. Voyager 1 took 3 years and 2 months. And then Voyager 2 took 2 years. So
right. So that so that just you put it in your head canon that, okay, it's probably more like a 10-year trip than a 1-year trip. But anyway, so he wants to be an astronaut. He wants to be on this mission to Titan. So he essentially goes to the black market to get himself DNA, to where he can actually use this other person's blood, use their hair, use all these kinds of things to be able to essentially fool the mechanisms of the day that test to see if you're what they consider a valid, which is a genetic enhanced person, or an invalid, which is someone who was born naturally. So then he takes this on, and so the film is essentially just following Ethan Hawke's character. I forget the name of the character in the film, but it's just basically him trying to get to Titan. And so the real questions that this film raises, are, again, is it morally right for us to play God in enhancing people genetically, or can we accept the fact that it might even lead to this imbalance in society, to people who are naturally conceived are considered like the lower the lower dregs of society, whereas the enhanced people are the ones who get all the prestigious jobs. And then there's this whole question of fate. Well, just because someone is conceived genetically, doesn't necessarily guarantee that they're going to be the best fit. The person that Ethan Hawke's character tries to get or wants to get the DNA from was an Olympic swimmer, but he was only ever able to get the silver medal. He was never able to attain the gold. So even though he was genetically enhanced to be a good swimmer, he still came in second best. So his being genetically enhanced didn't guarantee that he was going to be able to win the gold medal. And so he had an accident where he steps into a car, which I shouldn't say any more of because that would be kind of a spoiler. But
we've given people fair warning at this point,
Yes.
so we're going to have to go full spoilers.
I guess it would be kind of important to talk about it too, because it is about this whole journey and looking at these two individuals. So originally we learned that he was hit by a car, and so that's why he sold his DNA essentially on the black market, because now he can't do what he was essentially created to do. So Ethan Hawke's character is now trying to buy his DNA so that he can get on this mission to Titan. Through the course of the film, we learned that he didn't actually get hit accidentally. We learned that he actually walked in front of a car. He was trying to kill himself because he was essentially depressed, and that he was essentially guaranteed a good life, life as the best swimmer, but he wasn't able to obtain it. He was only ever able to become second best. So there's also this whole question of fate, and if we genetically enhance someone, well, does that necessarily guarantee that they'll be able to be the best at what they do, or even necessarily that they would be able to be the best, be better than the non-enhanced at certain things? So there's also this question of fate, and regarding do your genetics guarantee a poor life or guarantee a good life, or are there kind of ways to overcome this? So there's a lot of really interesting questions that are raised by the film, and that's kind of the synopsis in a nutshell.
Yeah, no, I think that's a pretty good summary. So, what I found really interesting about this one were, of course, the ethical issues regarding the creation of the enhanced, but also, people's personal journeys and how they grappled with this was what made it really interesting for me. The fact that there were new ethical dilemmas that came up that, we have parallels to now. But, of course, this is sci-fi, and, we don't have the exact scenario, but there are a lot of parallels with stuff we encounter today.
Yeah, there are a number of people, especially scientists working in the field, who believe that what they call the singularity isn't that far off, that it will happen probably in our lifetimes, or at least in the next generation. The singularity being kind of this future utopia of when science has unlocked the mysteries of human life and is able to, like John was talking about earlier, transfer someone's consciousness into an android body to obtain immortality, things like that. That's kind of what they mean by the singularity. And there are a lot of people who think that it's close, and then of course a lot of people don't think it's close at all. Gattaca, like I said, was set in the very near future, so I think the filmmakers believe that this is something that we'll have to wrestle with soon, because this technology is improving all the time.
Right.
So this is something. In fact, we've actually had a scientist in China who alleges that he was able to affect a human being at the genetic level. I don't think we know enough to know if he 100% for sure did it, but he raised the ire of the scientific community, because there's a lot of things that can go wrong if you start to mess with genetics. In fact, very, very worst case scenario, you could actually inadvertently introduce some kind of mutation that gets put into the human genetic code, and so you're essentially affecting humanity at the genetic level. You're not just changing one person's gene so that they don't get cancer, in the future. You might be doing that, but without proper knowledge, that gene might be necessary for some other thing that person needs to survive, or that humanity needs to survive. And so you could inadvertently introduce some kind of detrimental mutation into the human genetic code. So there's a lot of things, they're not anywhere near understanding the whole genome right now. I think that the Genome Project that was headed by Francis Collins, I think has concluded, but there's still a lot about genetics that scientists don't understand, and they're certainly not anywhere near at a point right now where they can start working on genetic enhancements. But who knows? It could be coming sometime in the near future, or in the further off future. I tend to think it's a lot more further off than the more optimistic people think.
Right. Was that I was trying to do a little research on that, but I think there was like a gentleman that had HIV, and they were going to do experiments on him, and then it impacted his daughters or something. Am I remembering?
I
thought I remember something similar to that.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly.
Okay.
So I remember he claimed that he did it. The scientists out of China claimed that he did it. I don't know if we're exactly sure for sure if he did it or not.
Yeah.
I'd have to go back and see, but that could be the same thing that I'm thinking of.
Yeah, it was just interesting because I know I could be misremembering on that. There was a Chinese scientist says he's the first to create genetically modified babies using the CRISPR technology.
Yeah,
CRISPR. A human embryo is modified with a gene editing technique to create twin girls. So I must be gene therapy because the father was HIV positive, and so the doctors went in with their technology to remove that, and the two twin girls do not have HIV, and they think it's through that manipulation. But it goes back to what you're saying is what happens now. Like we've mapped the genome, but that doesn't mean that we understand. It goes back to Ian Malcolm's. You're too busy, saying we can, not should.
I know why I quote it so often.
And I think that's with like you were going with the Gattaca thing of, we're creating a caste system when we start doing genetic modifications in humans, and eugenics. Everyone that's got a Facebook page has heard. Margaret Sanger was into eugenics, who is the founder of Planned Parenthood, and blah 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 blah.
Yeah,
so it's interesting.
Yeah, and incidentally, from what I've read, Margaret Sanger was actually opposed to abortion. She didn't want people of color to reproduce. She was certainly racist and a eugenicist, but she was all about contraception, not abortion. It wasn't until much later that Planned Parenthood became a staunchly pro-abortion organization. But anyway, that was just
interesting.
That had nothing really to do with what you were saying. I just found that interesting.
Well, I think it's interesting too, and it kind of raises a question of the butterfly effect here. That you just don't know the impact you're having with a lot of changes or actions you take today, because who knows how that mutation would affect 15 generations down the road. Same thing we're dealing with on a very small scale with this whole virus pandemic quarantine. How much are we affecting people's immune systems? I'm not buying into a lot of the conspiracies that are out there, but it is a concern for me if we're in the house for 3, 4, 5 months, what viruses haven't my kids been exposed to that they should have been exposed to, because we're constantly interacting with viruses and bacteria, and it's important for our immune system. So, we're going to end up sick for a couple of weeks as soon as we start going out in public again. That's a concern at a
Mhm.
small level. So I can only imagine, the implications messing with even a single portion of our genetic code would cause.
Yeah, so that's definitely a concern as far as actually developing the technology is concerned. But suppose we did manage to develop that technology and get it to the point where it's completely safe. Well, then that raises further ethical questions, like number one, the caste system, which is raised by the movie itself, Gattaca. Then
Mhm.
there are other questions such as, well, therapeutic gene enhancement doesn't seem morally problematic because, after all, we have doctors who will go in and remove a cancer. So why would it then be problematic for us to affect an embryo at the genetic level to prevent it from getting cancer? So so gene therapy seems like a morally unproblematic way to affect an embryo. But then, of course, that also comes back to, well, it's not, I don't know if it'll ever really be possible to genetically engineer an embryo that is conceived in the fallopian tube, because you have to really conceive, you have to genetically enhance something in order for all of its cells to be able to replicate with the enhancement. And so the way that you would do that is at the single cell zygote stage, you would enhance the cell. And that way, when it starts dividing, all of the cells will have the enhancement in it. So once you're able to actually go into a woman's uterus and affect the embryo genetically, it's probably too late at that point. So I don't know if it would ever be scientifically possible to genetically enhance a naturally conceived individual. So that might also be an issue as well, in that, number one, it wouldn't be possible to enhance naturally conceived children, but it would be possible to do that if you created one artificially. But then and that would also kind of lead to this disparity between those who are naturally conceived and those who are genetically enhanced. But also, might there come a point, in Gattaca this didn't happen because they wanted to make a point about the naturally conceived versus the genetically enhanced. But would there ever come a point that society would essentially mandate that we create children artificially instead of naturally? Because if you have certain people who are genetically enhanced, well, the people who are conceiving naturally are still conceiving with all of the negatives that come along with genetic degradation and genetic deformities, things like that. And so we're not going to, so, will they take a eugenicist tack, and that will they prevent us from conceiving naturally and try to get these, genetic deformities out of the gene pool and things like that? So you also have these kinds of questions. And then you have questions about, performance, in not just in sports, but in other areas like science. Would it be fair to pit someone who's been enhanced against someone who hasn't been enhanced and is just relying on their natural talents? So, you might have to create different forms of sports for those who are genetically enhanced, so that they don't have unfair advantages. But also, when it comes to just jobs like scientists, the people who are genetically enhanced would have certain advantages conferred on them by society that those who are naturally conceived wouldn't have. They're relying on their natural talents. So there are a lot of ethical problems with the possibility of gene enhancement.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah, one of the others that comes to mind for me too is, the genetic removal of obstacles for people, such as if we ever got to the point where we could remove depression or ADHD or these sort of things, it would seem very obvious that yes, this would be something we would want to do. But I hear so many stories of people who've come through things. I myself have personally been through bouts of depression that have ultimately been character building in some sense. I certainly wouldn't wish that on anybody, but it's also a point of, if you believe in a God, as I do, then, some of these challenges are certainly intended, in that, I wouldn't have the character I do today. So ultimately, would removing challenges that people experience ultimately lead to a denigration of character within culture?
right.
Yeah,
Well,
I think that's a good point too.
yeah, I think it goes back to the purpose of suffering. Why if God is perfect, holy, and good, why is there suffering in the world? You can point to the book of Job. In Job, suffered meaninglessly, quote unquote, excuse me, but there was an ultimate purpose was for God's glory. When Jesus, when the man that was born blind comes to him, and the disciples are like, oh, well, who sinned, the man or his parents, that he was called born blind? And Jesus says neither. He was born blind for the glory of God, and he heals him.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't know the full extent of the reasoning behind everything. And as a someone who's leans toward Reformed theology / Calvinistic, um, the whole the providential will of God is seen in there. And then going back to what you were talking about, Caleb, or not Caleb, but Clinton, in regards to mandating that all be artificially created. The Brave New World is a good example of that. It's considered a classic, and they have different alpha all the way down to epsilon class people that have been bred in or are created in test tubes, and depending on what you're supposed to do, like they negatively impact like epsilons that are supposed to go work in like a gas mine. Well, there will be the embryos will be exposed to high levels of chemicals and treated with this to where they develop a resistance to the environment that they're going into. And so this is, it kind of takes that to the Gattaca to the next level of, well, we have, this caste system of, the alphas are the ones that get to be, the beautiful, the pretty, and have, or whatever. But then there's the lower people keep doing the more menial tasks. So it's definitely there, and we're kind of seeing that today in a sense, I think.
Yeah, now I've never read Brave New World, but I probably should because I hear a lot of people talk about it. That in 1984.
Yes, Big Brother and Brave New World are both very interesting works. I would think for you as a bioethicist, I think Brave New World would be an interesting read for you because again they do genetically modify embryos to for their certain roles. So
Yeah, and hearing you talk about it, I was wondering if maybe Brave New World served as an inspiration for Gattaca.
It
Sounds
doesn't
like it might have.
say. Yeah, there's nothing on the wiki about it, but
Yeah, okay.
doesn't necessarily mean anything.
So, question kind of thrown out to anybody in this whole topic. So, what is the most reasonable approach for Christians to take on dealing with these issues, whether it's a discussion about them over a movie or whether it's dealing with the real life counterpart to this sort of thing? What should somebody who wants to approach this topic do? Where should they begin their research or begin preparing for having these kind of discussions?
I would
Yeah.
say, yeah, go for it, Clinton. You're the expert.
Go ahead. No, you can go ahead. I'll respond after you.
Okay, cool. I was just gonna say, like just being informed about the meaning. I don't want to say meaning of life, but having a clear sense of where you stand on the issue. Like, going back and getting to the mud a little bit of, is artificial insemination good or bad? Like making sure that you know where you stand on that, and then being able to branch out on that to find reliable sources for that, like reaching out to the organizations that Clinton represents, and being able to find reputable sources that you can read, and finding like a Cliff Notes version of the extended conversations that Clinton has given us tonight, and just being able to talk about how life has meaning, and through that we don't fully understand the outworkings of God's plan, but we have to trust that He is holding everything out for our greater good. So, and use the illustration, this man was born blind to bring glory to God. Nothing that he did in and of himself. This is something that God used to bring glory to His name, and that's our purpose in life. Our purpose is to bring glory to God, and that's what we got to go do.
That's well put.
Yeah. So I think a great thing to do is to watch movies like these that raise these questions and have discussions with the people that you watch them with. Jurassic Park and Gattaca. I love science fiction movies, especially because of the questions that they raise and the topics that they investigate. And Jurassic Park and Gattaca are science fiction at its absolute best. They are well-made movies, but they also do a very good job of investigating these things and of advancing the conversation. Now, there's a movie called Transcendence. I don't know if anyone has seen it. But it investigates the question of what John talked about earlier. If you upload your consciousness into an artificial thing, basically, are you the same individual as the person who uploaded it, or is it just, or did you die and someone else, and the artificial intelligence basically just thinks that it's the person who uploaded his consciousness? The problem is, Transcendence is a really, really boring movie, and it does a really poor job in investigating this topic, and so it's not a movie that I would not just promote but recommend for anyone to watch, because it's just a really bad movie. But Gattaca and Jurassic Park are fabulous movies, and they do a good job of discussing these topics, especially with the philosophical discussions that take place. So watching good science fiction films, which just kind of spur the imagination and spur dialogue on these, is a great way to start. And there are also introductory books that you can find on these topics too, that you can really start to read. One by I'm totally blanking. I know Agneta Sutton wrote an introduction to bioethics, which is good. And then there was Bioethics, a Primer for Christians, written by someone whose name escapes me at the moment, but that's another good introduction to it. And talking about transhumanism itself, which has to do with things like cloning and genetic enhancement, things that we talked about today. I actually recently read and reviewed a book by Fuzz Rana and Kenneth Samples called Humans 2.0, which is a great book that talks about these kinds of issues and other issues as well. But that's a book I would recommend for a good discussion on things like genetic enhancement and cloning, things like that. But again, those two introductory books I mentioned, Bioethics, a Primer for Christians, and the one written by Agneta Sutton. The name escapes me, but it's something, an introduction to bioethics, something along those lines. That's a good one to start with too. So there are good introductory books out there that you can find also to kind of get you started on these topics. Or just continue to read my writings on the LTI blog, and the stuff that I write, and you can listen to my podcast too, because we have these discussions. So that's a way to not trying to plug my other work, but I talk about these issues a lot too, and you can leave comments, or you can even just find me. You can email me. I'd be happy to recommend other works and to have these discussions too. So there's various ways you can do it.
Cool.
That's fantastic. I think that's all really good advice for people. I actually have that Primer for Christians book. I found it at Goodwill or something and picked it up, and haven't had a chance to look into it much yet. But on your recommendation, I'm going to have to dive in now.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Do we have time to talk about the movie you wanted to talk about, or?
I think so. You guys have a few more minutes.
I do.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
Because this is one I actually haven't seen, so I'm kind of interested in hearing your thoughts on it.
oh boy, you might have to mute for spoilers too, because it's going to be spoiler
That's true.
heavy.
That's true. I'll plug my ears and I'm not listening. I'm not listening.
So this one takes us in a little bit of a different kind of direction. We've talked a lot about bioethics, and I think Frailty is one of those movies that raises kind of a very different question that's very relevant to the world of apologetics. And so just to give our listeners a brief kind of 30-second rundown of the movie, Frailty is a suspense horror film written and directed by Bill Paxton, and he also stars in the film. And it's a very interesting movie where we see the main character, this Meeks fellow, that's the family's last name, comes into the police station and confesses that he knows who the God's Hands killer was, a serial killer that police detectives have been trying to hunt down and find. And it leads through his story as he begins to tell the detective about his childhood and how his father came home and claimed to have had a vision from God, and that they were supposed to begin this work exorcising demons or destroying demons, to put it as the father did. So he tells his probably 6 and 10-year-old son that this is what they're going to be getting, and it's this progress of the story as he's kind of sharing this with the detective. And eventually the father brings home this lead pipe and these gloves and this axe that are going to be their holy weapons for destroying these demons. And it continues on as the father kills a number of people. The older boy claims to not believe his dad and is trying to be protective of his younger brother. And, his dad keeps punishing him for his lack of belief and has him dig a basement for under their shed, where eventually they start bringing some of these victims. And it's all a very interesting story. And what eventually happens, this is where we get into real heavy spoilers, is the man talking to the detective, the Meeks boy, and he's older at this time. He's played by Matthew McConaughey. Takes him to show him where some of these bodies are buried. And then finally, as they're getting close, he begins to reveal to him kind of the secret, in that, he was describing himself as this older brother who never really believed what was going on. And eventually he reveals that he's the younger brother who believed all along that his father was doing the right thing. And it's revealed that the older brother had actually went on to become a serial killer who had killed a number of people. But then the movie takes a really important twist at the very end, where Adam Meeks, who's the one who's been telling this story, begins to tell the detective that he's actually there for him. And parts of the movie start to come together. The father claimed when he laid hands on people, they were revealed to be demons. And you begin to see flashbacks where you see what the father sees when he laid hands on people, sees them, murdering children and doing some awful things. And you find out the same thing about the detective. When Adam lays his hands on him, he finds out that he had actually recently just killed his mother. And then another important clue that was given throughout the movie is that the father always said God would protect them from things. And as they're reviewing the tape, once this detective goes missing, they see that Adam's face when he comes in and leaves the police station is completely blurred out on the videotape. So the revelation of the movie puts the whole question of the movie in a different context. The big question of the movie that lingers in viewers' minds is what would you do if, God asked you to kill somebody? And it seems like the answer is a resilient no. I mean, they've got to be crazy. They've got to be nuts to do something like this. But the movie changes perspective, because at the end you realize that there was actually truth to the claims, in that the Meeks family, the younger brother and his father, had been protected somehow, and that all these claims made about protection and destroying demons appear to actually be true. And so it puts the whole movie and everything you've seen in the last hour and a half in a very different perspective. And for me personally, that's one of the interesting things about this movie. I mean, it has a number of great quotes as well. The movie starts off with the Adam telling the detectives, you haven't heard me out yet, and already you're doubting me. It gives you some clues along the way. It asks questions. At one point, Fenton, the older brother in the childhood flashbacks, was watching a cartoon that asked about, why did God let this happen? So it deals heavily with the problem of evil. And, eventually Fenton, the brother who had not believed, eventually abandons God entirely, any belief in God. And this is what seems to lead to nihilism for him very early in life as a 10, 12-year-old, that eventually leads to him going on a murder spree and killing people, as he's completely out of the loop on what the rest of the family is seeing as well. And it seems to be this clear nihilistic road. So for me, it's very interesting in the questions it raises, but particularly this kind of central one, and how it all changes as a matter of perspective.
Yeah, I think it's interesting with the Frailty in that like you were saying, the twist in, you think it's the brother that, like the guy coming in is talking about his brother is the one that's doing all the wrong killings.
Right.
And then he's able to, the detective finds out that, he committed a murder and that he's on his list. And then the big thing is the wife at the end, who is with him on that.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so how would you argue or maybe discuss? Because again, this is God told me to do it, and we get that a lot in certain movements in Christianity today. God told me to tell you that, if you give me, $1,000, you'll get 10,000 back, or or something more sinister in something like this. How do you, you know, is this any different from God commanding the destruction or the ban, or put to the ban of the Canaanites?
Right. And I think that's a very challenging question. It's certainly one that comes up in a lot of ways, shapes, and forms. For me personally, I take a very, very skeptical approach to claims I hear people make, whether they're Christian or not. It doesn't influence how much accountability and trust I'm going to put into that person to begin with. trust is a thing that's got to be earned somewhat for me, and I don't lend a lot of it out right off the bat to new sources if I'm seeking for information and guidance. So skepticism for me is an important tool in terms of analyzing those things, because I think eventually, your works show very much what kind of guidance you actually have. I also am very skeptical in terms of how much people verbally hear God's voice today and that sort of thing. I don't think doesn't happen. I'm not a full-on cessationalist.
Right.
But I think that it all is very specific, such as with miracles. I think in addition to miracles just being a supernatural interaction into the world, miracles also come with a message from God. We often see a lot of the really incredible miracles that are documented today happen in areas where Christianity has just kind of made it into the culture and is beginning to grow. And that's where we see some of these really radical miracles take place. So I think miracles also have a message attached to it. So I don't necessarily think that God is doing a lot of communicating verbally with people, giving them instructions what to do. Not to say that it never happens, but I certainly take a good dose of skepticism with that. What I think this movie does, though, especially in dealing with those questions, is it takes the question and it says, are you looking at this with a good perspective? Because to just look at a scenario and say, well, this person claims God is speaking to them for some reason, so I'm going to automatically write that off entirely, is quite different from a naturalistic worldview versus a Christian worldview. The naturalistic worldview, it's never going to be a possibility in any sense of the word. You're going to write it off. From a Christian worldview, even though it may be very unlikely that that's happening, it is a possibility, and it changes the moral nature of those outcomes. In this movie, it completely flips the question on its head. It's not a question of whether or not you would kill somebody if God asked you to. It's a question of it changes that perspective. If God is really doing something, if he is really commanding it, then it's not only the right thing to do, but it is it's the action that must be taken, because if it's something God's directing, then there's a reason for it. Now, I'm not condoning that anybody, take this as my condonement that God's telling you to kill anybody or anything like that. So that's certainly not the case. And again, I don't see that as the way God speaks to people today. But for issues like the conquest of the Canaanites, it does give a different perspective. If God has commanded something, then there's a reason for it. The God we believe in is an omnipotent, all-knowing creator who would have a purpose, and any command he gives would be for a reason, not just arbitrary murder, as you kind of think all these acts are throughout the movie. The Canaanites were pretty terrible people. From what we know best from archaeology, it seems like they sacrificed a lot of babies. I'm sure we've talked about, the Moloch statues before that they would roast babies on. I mean, that's pretty barbaric stuff.
Yeah, we're talking about abortion here. Like, we often refer to abortion as modern Molech worship, but yeah, they would actually take, born children and burn them and things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they influenced the Israel kings. I mean, that was was it Ahab? My Old
Mhm.
Testament kings. Like that was one of the accusations was, you know, he, the prophets would go to him and like, you make your children pass through the fire, and that was my understanding is a fairly graphic and very violent and horrible way to kill someone.
Yeah. So yeah, for me, I think it's a great movie for that kind of discussion because there's a drastic difference between a naturalistic perspective and one that leaves any room for the supernatural and God's intervention. Now, of course, this one is disturbing on both sides of it. In terms of, I'm not sure if it's more disturbing before the twist or after the twist, but the whole point of that twist is it flips your thinking on its head. So now you didn't start off having a question of, well, this is clearly wrong. But by the end of the movie, it's flipped around, and you have to wonder: is this a good guy because he was really following God's mission all along in these actions? And it's disturbing to think that God would ask somebody to do that today. And I certainly don't believe that people are demons in the sense that is kind of revealed at the end of this movie, that they really are demons that are being killed. I certainly don't think that's the case. I don't believe that humans are demons. Again, another talk for a whole show on demonology and all that stuff, but certainly don't believe people are demons. So this is not
Yeah.
something I believe would actually ever happen in any sense of it. But the philosophical questions involved and how it twists perspectives and lets you think about those things from a different angle, naturalism versus a supernatural worldview. I think that's interesting. And I think the more we can do that in some of our conversations to flip things around and help people see things from a different worldview, the more ground we're going to be able to gain in conversations and really understanding where somebody's coming from and explaining our points.
Yeah, I think that's important to, you're talking about how to approach someone in discussing, Gattaca or the other one, Jurassic Park. And I think, did we lose Clinton? I guess he's still
No,
around, maybe.
I think his camera's just off for a minute.
Yeah. And so I think the important thing is, again, it goes back to understanding, having at least a good concept of who you are and your belief structure, and then from that being able to go out to talk about different worldviews, and sometimes it means reading the opposition, like being able to offer a reason for being able to understand another person's point of view, and some of that just comes from listening. I find for myself, I enjoy conversations. I like listening to someone. I guess I'm kind of a sociologist and like, okay, well, let's talk about why you think that. Like, what led to this? And so, sometimes my friends get upset when I'm trying to defend, someone who's done some fairly stupid actions, and I'm like, well, no, yes, he did this, but you got to understand the 20 years behind that one act. And so I think that helps us as believers to be able to engage someone in a conversation and not be quick to condemn. And like you're saying, offer a different perspective, but come from it. I think the most effectual things have been just remaining calm. I've listened to Tyler debate a couple of times and listened to some of his conversations that he's had on with atheists, and remain calm. It's not a shouting match. It's not a you're a big fat poo poo head or whatever. Well, I think that kind of happened in Texas, but that's neither here nor there. Some of the more classic atheists that he's had interaction with have been that way. It's just a conversation that you're having with someone.
Yes, your mother was a hamster and your father smelled of elderberries.
Yes, I think that was pretty much sums up Texas there. But no, so I think
Now go away, or we will taunt you a second time.
Oh my gosh, it was fun. But no, I think that's the important thing is when we're offering an alternative to naturalism, just being able to offer it in a calm approach to it, and I think that helps to because they're used to people shouting at them. Well, just have a conversation with them. Try to figure out. Joel's doing his study on deconversionism. Well, there's a lot of history behind why someone leaves the faith. There's different things that have happened to this individual, and so understanding that may help present better arguments to not only the atheists, but to those who might be struggling with their faith, being able to say, hey, I understand you're coming from this ultra-conservative background that doesn't question anything, but let me tell you it's okay, and offer a reasonable explanation for your faith.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that conversations are so critical, and I think it's one reason I enjoy things like this movie and any kind of Lovecraftian horror, which almost always has that same kind of twist in it, that it twists your worldview. You find out the world you're interacting with is not the one that you thought it was. It's actually one ruled by ancient gods who have nothing on their mind except the complete and utter destruction and chaos within the universe.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a different perspective. It flips it around and puts it all in a different perspective and lets you look at things from a different angle.
Yeah.
And when you can do that in a conversation, I think it makes a lot of difference in terms of how you relate with people and in terms of the bridges you build there too.
Yeah. Sounds good. I don't know. Sometimes my patience for some people is kind of slow, or low. So that's one of the reasons why I don't make a good debater, because I'm like, I would be the one that you're just a big fat poo-poo head. Go away. You're an idiot. Go away. I don't have time for this. Just whatever.
It's
fine.
hard. The chemical shots you get in the brain, during heated discussions, especially when they touch on core things to your life. I mean, it's hard to learn to even control those shots of adrenaline, much less to kind of use it to your advantage the way people do in debates. It's something very impressive. It's one reason I love watching a good debate, is because people who can control that's quite a skill.
Definitely.
All right, gentlemen. Well, it has been a good discussion. If nobody has any final thoughts to wrap things up, I think we've given some good constructive feedback for how people can go out and start engaging some of these issues we've talked about. A few recommendations for movies to make them think on some of these issues. And
one not recommended.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so if people have suggestions for movies or music or TV shows you'd really love to see us discuss, I'm open to doing some more of these. So
yeah, this has been fun.
Yeah, it's been great. So drop a comment in the comments on YouTube and leave us leave us some suggestions as to what you'd like to see next time we do one of these. Let us know why you think it would be great for this kind of discussion. Feel free to comment on what you're seeing here. Be sure to like this video and give us a subscribe too if you're enjoying the content.
Like, share, and subscribe.
All right. Well, let me send us out. Let me see here. I should have had our outro ready to play before I said I would send us out. So, yeah. So now we can actually do the outro.